on the question how much is corruption, even social corruption, corruption of culture, language, and so on, natural in Rousseau. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau has always received a somewhat special treatment among the philosophers of the 18th century. It is hardly surprising, given his radically different take on the idea of historical progress that dominated the Enlightenment, according to which man was seen as gradually emancipating and stepping on the path to reason. By the end of the century, this view had been summarized into a series of stages or epochs of human history in two great works, namely the Le Tableau historique, or in the English translation, the full English translation, Outlines of an Historical View of the Progress of the Human Mind by Marquis de Condorcet, and Le Tableau philosophique, a philosophical review of the successive advances of human mind by the economist Anne Robert Jacques Rousseau. But these are only two examples of a wider current in the theoretical writings of the 18th century, which employed a method of the so-called conjectural history, a term coined by the Scot Douglas Stewart in 1793. In the philosophical inquiries of the time, especially in France and Scotland, conjectural history was a popular genre, which employed speculations and hypothetical reasonings in trying to discover the probable historical origins of all things human, from money and government to knowledge and language. In at least two of his main works, the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality from 1754 and the Essay on the Origin of Languages, which was published 3 years after Rousseau's death, but he worked on it around about the time or immediately after the Discourse on Inequality. Rousseau also constructs his arguments from the point of view of an hypothetical history. So it is not so much the historical narrative or its method that sets him apart from his contemporaries. After all, Rousseau can be viewed as one of the best proponents of the various discourses on the origins, so-called. So although the results of the applications of these historiographical methods were different, sometimes even considerably different, in authors such as Adam Smith, Turgot, Abbé Condillac, Condorcet, and the encyclopedists, to name only a few, what Rousseau had in common with them was the general idea that the true philosophical inquiry of any present state must unveil, by these very methods, the origins of this state in the distant and often undocumented past. However, Rousseau stands out of this crowd precisely in that wherever these thinkers saw gradual progress, he found inevitable degeneration and corruption. I will try to explore this image of Rousseau as an irremediable pessimist by analyzing certain aspects of his interpretation of human development, which points to a more complex and seemingly contradictory side of his project. Undoubtedly, can Rousseau be viewed as one of the most noticeable thinkers of corruption in this wider sense, due to frequent expressions of regret over the events that must have caused history to go so very wrong. I will concentrate on the story of the corruption of language in the essay on the origins of language, complemented by some relevant passages in the Discourse on Inequality. As Jan Starobinsky has nicely put it, the two works can be read as two versions of the same narrative. While in the Discourse, the discussion of language is only an episode in the general history of society, in the essay, on the other hand, the emergence of societies is treated only as far as it supports his views on the origins of language. But as any careful reader of the opening paragraphs of the essay can notice, in the heart of its undertaking there seems to be a paradox, which Rousseau initiates by stating that, quote, "Since speech is the first social institution, it owes its form to natural causes alone," end of quote. Given the central place the opposition between the natural and the social realm occupies in Rousseau's examination, it seems counterproductive at best to tie them together in this way, but it is a decisive moment with far-reaching consequences. Derrida, a close reader of Rousseau's essay, of course, identifies this, as he says, break in the field of natural causality, as a paradoxical event where nature is, so to speak, playing against herself to, quote, naturally inaugurate an order radically heterogeneous to the natural order, end of quote. Language, specifically speech, is thus a weird amalgam, inasmuch as it is a point of transition from nature to society, or from the necessary to the arbitrary. It is governed by the arbitrary laws of humans because it is conventional. Yet the very existence of speech, or rather its form, as Rousseau points out, is enabled by natural, that is, necessary causes alone, and nothing else. The transition from the blind innocence of natural state to corrupt civilization, of which speech is only the first institution, is something belonging exclusively to man. But sociality as such does not rest in any special innate faculty he would be endowed with, but is rather a result of an outer force of nature drawing him towards it. In other words, the step of man into the realm of arbitrary speech is neither deliberate nor predestined, but something he has been manipulated into, or as Rousseau says in an important passage on language in the Discourse, the departure from the state of nature, quote, would be an indictment of nature, not of him whom nature has so constituted. But if nature herself is the one to have given birth to her opposite, that is the arbitrary, social, or unnatural order, any reductionist would be quick to point out that the very polarity Rousseau is going to build on through the rest of the essay must necessarily collapse into one. If the emergence of society through language, or vice versa as we shall see, has natural causes, does it not make both society and language a part of the natural order, so that the dividing line between the natural and arbitrary orders is obscured? Corruption, then, as far as it is always perceived by Rousseau as some kind of regrettable departure from the origin, would turn out to be a consequence of natural causes, however mediated. Instead of being an order radically heterogeneous in Derrida's words, Rousseau would be forced to accept that the arbitrary realm of society and language, as far as it arises from natural causes, can only be a subclass of and be reduced to the natural order, in short, to be homogeneous with it. In fact, I think there is some support for this interpretation in Rousseau that goes beyond this quick reductionist reasoning. The reading of Rousseau, structured around the divide between nature and culture, has been made popular by Claude Lévi-Strauss and Derrida, and is based primarily on the discourse on the origins of inequality. In the essay on the origin of languages, on the other hand, while still present, this divide is much less pronounced, to the point where it cannot be viewed as a strict dichotomy. First, we must distinguish between the state of nature, which is the time of solitary savage individuals with no permanent social bonds, which is irrecoverably lost once first societies had been formed, and the natural causes, which continue to regulate human affairs even after speech as the first social institution has emerged. The orders of natural necessity and of social arbitrariness are never wholly separated. But it is not only for the obvious reason that we cannot escape the laws of physics while living in a society. As it is clear from several passages in the essay, it is actually the arbitrary order itself which is, so to speak, subjected to natural necessities. Let us look at some of the examples. First, before opening his long digression on the differences between the languages of the North and South, I shall say something about that later, in chapter 9 of the essay, Rousseau proposes, quote, "Let us try to follow the order of nature itself," end of quote. What follows is a long explanation of how these differences are a consequence of natural migrations and settlements of people in different climates. So it is not only the emergence of language as such that is due to external forces of nature, but according to Rousseau, also the variety of languages. In other words, that which has always been interpreted in terms of arbitrary culture. Second example. The first language must have been based on the unarticulated cries of nature. Rousseau's basic claim underlying the whole argument of the essay is that speech did not emerge among people because of their needs, but because of their emotions. As he says, quote, not hunger nor thirst, but love, hatred, pity, anger wrung their first voices from them, end of quote. The hypothetical first spoken language was onomatopoeic. It expressed ideas of things and beings either with an imitation of sound of perceived objects themselves or of the effects they had on other objects and beings, or with an accent of an accompanying emotion. Because it expressed not only things, but also different emotions connected with them, this language must have been rich with synonyms, irregularities, accentuated vowels expressing the feelings of the heart. It probably had no grammar, according to Rousseau, no abstract words, and almost no articulated sound, since the cries of emotions had little need for consonants. It was very figurative and was sung rather than spoken. Languages today, on the other hand, are simple and methodical, precise and articulated. They make use of a lot of abstract terms instead of synonyms. Ideas have taken place of emotions. The changes from the primitive speech to modern languages were slow and gradual. As people were becoming more and more knowledgeable about the world, their speech grew colder, addressing the ideas of the mind rather than the feelings of the heart. There is no need to emphasize that, in this sense, modern languages are corrupt, according to Rousseau. But what is more important in this context is how this description is concluded. Rousseau explicitly denies that the speakers have any responsibility for this corruption. As he said, quote, "This progress seems to me entirely natural," end of quote. Further, there is nothing conventional even about our direction of writing from left to right, according to Rousseau. I'm picking up different examples from the essay. After adopting the direction from right to left from the Phoenicians, the Greeks decided to write in furos, that is, continuing, as it were, a single line alternatively from right to left and vice versa, because that facilitated reading. But in order to enable the spreading of manuscripts, they had eventually learned to write from left to right, since that is a considerably more, again, natural way to write by hand. Finally, in the last chapter, commenting on the effects brought by the invasion of barbarians into Rome, who are directly responsible for the corrupt state of modern languages and especially music, again, Rousseau explicitly denies the arbitrariness of these events. I quote again, "These progresses are neither accidental nor arbitrary. They are due to the vicissitudes of things." End of quote. So, I think it is clear from these passages that the distinction between the necessity of nature and the conventions of culture, while not wholly absent, cannot be central to Rousseau's discussion of the corruption of language and music in the essay. While Rousseau does state in the first chapter that language of humans is conventional, he leaves almost no room for conventions to take place in his historical conjectures. In the end, it is always the natural causes delivering the explanation. But I think that there are at least two other oppositions. Strangely hinged on one another, Rousseau quietly builds on in both essay and the second discourse to convey arbitrariness into his argument. The first is the opposition between the natural and the theological explanation. We must not forget that Rousseau's references to not natural causes serve a double function. They not only reveal that the development of language is largely natural as opposed to conventional, but they are also intended to lay forward the ambition to avoid unnatural or supernatural causation, a divine agent. Of course, given this wider perspective, it is much easier to reconcile nature with society than with miracles. Second, as we shall see, it is much more the distinction between the necessity and the contingent events that determines Rousseau's solution of the problem. And the contingent side of the divide is designed precisely to relieve the project of the burden of all sorts of theological hypotheses. Let us now look at how Rousseau deals with the first challenge, that is, how he manages to avoid the theological account of the transition from the state of nature to society, or more specifically in this case, to language as the first social institution. Rousseau's discussion in the Discourse on Inequality closely follows the problems laid forward by Condillac. Yet he fully acknowledges the complexity of this issue, apparently puzzled by a series of difficulties that seem to imply a danger of a circular argument. The first difficulty in the discourse consists in deciding whether the true originator of language is a mother or her child. If one supposes, as Rousseau does, that the child has a bigger motivation to communicate his or her needs to the mother, and that therefore the child must be the first inventor of a few distinct sounds endowed with meaning, then there would be as many languages as there are people, according to Rousseau, since there would be nothing to guarantee the consistency of such a language among different individuals, due to the fact that in the state of nature, people led nomadic lives and had no permanent social bonds with one another. If, on the other hand, we suppose that it is the mother who teaches her child to express his or her basic needs, then this seems to beg the question, because in turn it remains unclear how the mother herself had learned that language. So that's the first difficulty. Without giving an answer to this problem, Rousseau faces an even bigger and more philosophical difficulty, namely, how can the origin of language be explained when language and thought seem to presuppose one another? Apparently unsatisfied by the explanation provided by Condillac, Rousseau puts forward the following dilemma. Quote, "For if men needed speech in order to learn how to think, they needed even more to know how to think in order to find the art of speech." End of quotation. And then the last and most important difficulty is developed from the following criticism Rousseau addresses to Condillac. I quote again, "The manner in which this philosopher, namely Condillac, resolves the difficulties he himself raises regarding the origins of instituted science shows that he assumed what I question, namely some sort of society already established among the inventors of language." End of quote. This is a crucial point for Rousseau. While he has been able to establish that the first and most universal form of speech must have been a cry of nature, he fails to find a satisfying account of the transformation of this unarticulated language into any form of language in the proper sense. Clearly incapable of identifying the crucial principle that would explain how people began communicating their needs and emotions without a stable society, Rousseau raises the seemingly unresolvable question of how language and sociability are connected. And it is in this passage that he seems to hint at the possibility of the theological hypothesis. I quote Rousseau again. "As for myself, frightened by the increasing difficulties and convinced of the almost demonstrated impossibility that languages could have arisen and been established by purely human means, I leave to anyone who wishes to undertake it the discussion of this difficult problem. Which is the more necessary? The already united society for the institution of languages, or already invented languages for the establishment of societies?" End of quote. This last difficulty in the discourse must be read together with this so-called climatological hypothesis in the essay. Rousseau never fully allows for the supernatural cause to enter his chain of explanation, although even in the essay he seems to not have denied it completely. In this respect, the story about the so-called "a touch of the finger," which recognizes the differences in climate to play a decisive role in history of humans, proves crucial for Rousseau's narrative. I quote Rousseau again, this is from the essay. "He who willed man to be sociable inclined the globe's axis at an angle to the axis of the universe with a touch of the finger. With this slight motion, I see the face of the earth change, and the vocation of mankind settled." End of quotation. From here, the whole story of the differences between northern and southern languages unfolds. Suddenly, Rousseau is able to demonstrate that people in the idyllic settings of moderately warm climates, where they, by their nature, hardly had any needs to cooperate, were nevertheless forced to socialize eventually, either because of the rare need to overcome the consequences of some natural disaster, or in the case they happened to use the same water sources. It was in these instances, according to Rousseau, that the first agreements, disagreements, love encounters, and celebrations took place, spontaneously inducing communication based on the accentuated voices of passion. In the northern climates, on the other hand, where the winters are long and harsh, cooperation is critical for survival, and so it becomes the main motivation of sociability. As Rousseau describes it, in those regions where the earth yields whatever it yields only after much labor, and where the source of life seems to reside more in the hands than in the heart, man, constantly involved in providing for their subsistence, hardly thought about gentler bonds. Everything was confined to physical impulsion, opportunity dictated choice, ease dictated preference. Unlike in the south, then, the first words might have been aidez-moi instead of aimez-moi. So, help me instead of love me, which in turn explains the general character of the northern languages. They are cold, articulated, noisy, and unmelodic. The importance of this story about the slight push of the finger lies less in the fact that it finally determines the missing link between language and society, than in the place it occupies in the general strategy of Rousseau's argument. While in the discourse, as we have seen, Rousseau expresses doubt whether languages could have been established by purely human means, in the essay we are faced with an answer that opens two ways of understanding these doubts. What exactly is outside these purely human means? In other words, to whom does this finger belong? Of course, the interpretation which sees divine interference in this passage, that is, the finger of God, presents itself almost automatically. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it is the second distinction, the distinction between necessity and contingency, rather than the one between natural and supernatural, that provides the key to Rousseau's view on why language is essentially corrupt. Rousseau does not need to decide whether the differences in climates are caused by God's finger of providence or some accidental idiosyncrasy in nature herself. After all, these two options are not necessarily incompatible. It is rather the opposition between the necessary and therefore predictable laws of nature and a series of contingent and unforeseeable events or breaches in this steady order that structure Rousseau's explanation. The theological hypothesis, should anyone want to recover it, can peacefully reside inside this larger opposition, because from now on, contingency takes full responsibility, as it were, for misfortunes of people. The slight motion of the finger should be understood as only the first in the series of contingent events in nature, making the possibility of the full-blown theological explanation irrelevant or secondary. So, how does this contingency intervene? Rousseau's conjectural history of mankind, of which his discussion of the origin of languages in the essay is only a part, is full of catastrophes. It is evident that whenever he fails to deliver an account of events that would pass as natural by his own standards, disasters take place to move things forward towards the present state of corruption. In the discourse, for example, quote, some fatal accident which, for the sake of the common utility, should never have occurred, end of quote, ended the happiest period of man, in which he resembled the savages described by modern discoverers. The fact that there still are savage societies is taken by Rousseau as an indication of the state we would still be in had the catastrophe not occurred. Similarly, in the essay, Rousseau identifies the floods, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and fires started by lightning as the prime motivators for primitive alliances of people in the south, which enabled them to overcome and restore the damages. And since it is hard to imagine how people came about the idea to look for iron ore or smelt it properly, again, quote, some extraordinary event, such as volcano throwing up molten metal, end of quote, must have occurred to push people towards the supposedly utilitarian and harmless art of metallurgy. However, the status of these catastrophes is somewhat peculiar, as they are both external and inherent to the order of nature, a fatal conspiracy of providence and an unfortunate combination of natural circumstances. They represent an interruption of the harmonious order of nature by violent contingents, or, as Derrida puts it, an arbitrary and exterior causality which also has to, quote, act along natural or quasi-natural lines, end of quote, from Derrida. The contingent disasters are thus both natural and unnatural, or rather, natural, but presenting themselves as contrary to natural order and the ways they are supposed to take, or the ways the natural order is supposed to take. Contingency, in short, is a sort of an eccentricity in nature, in nature's character, as if incompatible with her usual ways. Of course, the essay on the origin of languages and the discourse on inequality are concerned primarily with the question of how civilization is only ever bringing corruption and misery to people. In this sense, natural disasters are interpreted as unfortunate accidents diverting the course of human history. But in the essay, Rousseau goes even further in showing that there is a corrupting force in nature. It is not enough that natural disasters disturb what could otherwise have been a harmonious life on earth. What is more, men even actively prevent and mitigate nature's self-destructive tendencies. In a remarkable passage, often neglected by commentators, Rousseau presents an image which must sound utterly heretic to the ears of any present-day ecologist. The first state of the earth, that is before humans, was one of chaos, frequent revolutions, and confusion. Disasters were much more frequent, as if war between the natural powers had to maintain a certain equilibrium, bringing about in a few hours what 100,000 human hands now do in a century, as Rousseau said. Let me quote a brief passage from this fascinating image. Quote, the entire, that is the image of nature alone, nature without, what would happen to the earth without people. The entire earth would soon have been covered with nothing but trees and ferocious beasts. Eventually, everything would have perished. The water cycle, which nourishes the earth, would little by little have broken down. Mountains get worn down and smaller. Rivers silt up. The sea rises and spreads. Everything imperceptibly tends towards the same level. The hand of man slows this drift and delays this progress. Without them, it would proceed faster, and the earth might perhaps already be underwater. So, end of quote. Nature makes no effort to sustain living conditions on earth, and while wars, the burning of cities, mining, cutting down trees, draining or channeling of rivers, and other civilized activities bring misery to people, they are by no means corrupting nature, but rather counterbalancing her self-corrupting inclinations. But let us return to the problem of corruption in the social realm, and more specifically to language and music. As we have seen, it is only a distant ramification of contingent natural events. Jan Starobinsky has nicely summarized the causal connection between nature and society in Rousseau in a sort of a giant syllogism, as he said. A quote from Starobinsky: social institution is a delayed consequence of a primitive disposition of which the effects are unfolded very slowly at a distance from the origin under the influence of exceptional conditions, which have solicited the rise of virtual faculties. End of quote. Corruption, as well as progress, are not innate to man, any more than language and sociality, but are the result of a faculty Rousseau calls in the discourse la faculté de se perfectionner, or la perfectibilité. So, sort of ability to perfect oneself, ability to evolve, which, together with freedom, separates the human race from beasts, but remains dormant and potential until awoken by some exceptional external impulse, such as a natural disaster. Only through this excited perfectibility has man been able to leave the state of nature, and it is due to this virtual faculty that he makes progress in good as well as in evil, according to Rousseau. But returning to the problem of languages, how is it that the languages of the South, so full of natural inflections of the voice and so harmonic, did not prevail, at least not in Europe? Rousseau's answer is, of course, pointing at another catastrophic event. But this time, it is not a natural disaster, although it is a distant effect or a distant consequence of the slight motion of the finger. In Chapter 8, before beginning his climatological hypothesis, Rousseau states that mankind is born in warm climates, in warm countries, that it spreads from there to the cold lands of the north, and, after a long period of multiplication, flows back to the south. The last step of this sketchy account of migrations is exactly what the invasion of the barbarians is in the end of Chapter 19. The effects this historical event had on Greco-Roman culture bear all of the characteristics that Rousseau found in his analysis of the differences between North and South. Europe, invaded by crude and ignorant men, lost its arts and sciences and its perfected and harmonious language. The voice of these men was harsh and accentless, noisy without being sonorous. Their articulations were grating, their voices nasal and dull. Their songs had nothing in common with the melodiousness of the Greeks and the metrics of the Romans. Since their language was born out of need rather than emotion, prose was closer to their spirit than singing or poetry. And after they, meaning the barbarians, had accustomed the subjected people to the noisiness of their speech, the fate of modern languages and music was sealed. Melodic songs of inflected voices, which originated from the natural characteristics of the southern languages, were gradually replaced by harmonies, accidentally discovered in a few chords when the descendants of the barbarians were trying to make their songs more sonorous. Rousseau devotes the majority of the second part of the essay to the opposition between melody and harmony. He sees the latter as cold, calculated, and unfit to imitate emotions, as opposed to expressive music of the Greeks, for instance, which was full of energy. By the end of the essay, everything becomes connected with language. The corruption of language brought not only corruption of music, poetry and drama, but also of eloquence. Modern languages, unsonorous and unmelodic, are not suitable for addressing crowds at public spaces, as speech simply cannot be understood at a distance due to lack of melody and measure. And that, in turn, has political implications. For, as Rousseau concludes the essay, I quote, "I maintain that any language," and he means modern European languages like English, German, French, "I maintain that any language in which it is not possible to make oneself understood by the people assembled is a servile language. It is impossible for a people to remain free and speak that language." Which reminds me of a news that I read yesterday, that François Hollande has said somewhere in Africa that French is actually the language of freedom. So, Rousseau disagrees very strongly. To conclude, let me add 2 points on the notion of corruption in Rousseau. First, as we have seen in the case of the barbarians, the corruptions happening in the arbitrary order of culture, in this case language and music, but it as well applies to all social development, are only distant consequences of natural causes and the perfectibility of humans. But we must not forget that the inverse statement also holds, namely, that the natural order itself is not free of arbitrariness. The implication is inevitable. Through contingent catastrophes, the corruption of everything social becomes an intrinsic part of nature. But while the corruption of culture is largely natural as opposed to arbitrary, it is also true that, for Rousseau, the corruption of nature is arbitrary due to the contingency of catastrophes and coincidences. So, in the end, we are left with a position that is very uncommon for a philosopher of the 18th century and very paradoxical. Corruption is the fate of humanity. It is natural, but it is by no means necessary. Humans had no opportunity to prevent it, and yet it should not have happened. The second point, an important point about the notion of corruption in Rousseau is that it demonstrates itself as differentiation. Corruption is not simply a transformation from something pleasant to something unpleasant, or from good to evil, but it is it is in a way always a departure from the pure and unspoiled origin, and this departure always manifests itself as splitting up, as falling apart. In the end, the corruption of language and music lies in the fact that they are no longer united. In the beginning, speech, song, poetry, and eloquence were all one, according to Rousseau, and he's following Condillac on this point. And it is in their violent division through the various stages in history that they lose their original energy and expressivity. When language was sonorous, melodic, and rhythmic, the transition from speech to declamation and chant were imperceptible. Condillac makes a very similar statement about the original unity of dance, pantomime, and gestures. But this view has a long tradition in philosophy, particularly in the debates about language. Until the 17th century, the standard account of the reasons for the corrupt state of language had pointed towards the Adam's fall, an event after which Adam had lost the original unity of ideas and words and was therefore unable to reconstruct the knowledge contained in the names he had given to things and animals, under the supervision of God. Without this unity, thought and speech separate, and the only bond they are able to sustain is an unsecure bond of representation, which is often deceptive. Another catastrophe, which brought obstacles to communication, was found in the story of the Tower of Babel, which is a story of differentiation and loss of unity par excellence. This differentiation also closely relates to Derrida's famous reading of Rousseau's essay in the second part of his On Grammatology, where he extracts a series of oppositions that appear throughout Rousseau's text, such as south and north, melody and harmony, sound and articulation, vowel and consonant, but also passions and reason, and finally, the most important for Derrida, of course, speech and writing. The second half of every such opposition is interpreted by Rousseau as some sort of corruption of the first, as a departure from the pure origin, or, in Derrida's terms, a supplement of the original presence. Now, while Rousseau wants to show that these corruptions are due to causes external to the pure origin, such as the catastrophes, Derrida is, of course, trying to show that what he calls différence, this difference with an A, is always already in the origin, that the origin has always been split and differentiated. In other words, that there has never been a pure and unspoiled origin. So one should therefore not forget that language and music did not get corrupt simply by change and unspecified degradation, but literally by decay or decomposition. Language was spoiled by losing its musical self, and music was spoiled by losing the melody and rhythm of the original language. So the corruption of Rousseau is much less passing away in the Aristotelian sense as it is literally falling apart. And the last point I would like to make is that for Rousseau, corruption is not only the opposite of progress, in the sense that the majority of philosophers of the Enlightenment understood it, but that it is often also disguised as progress. This, of course, makes it all the more difficult to detect.